Okay, so let's get into the basic physiology of testosterone. Testosterone is derived from the cholesterol molecule. It is a hormone. Hormones are simply our body's internal messaging system. Hormones send signals around the body telling the body how to behave. So testosterone, when you are low in cholesterol levels, oftentimes can be compromised a little bit. So we really want optimal cholesterol levels. That's one thing that people with low testosterone can run into problems with, or low cholesterol rather, can run into problems with low testosterone as well. So we want adequate cholesterol. Testosterone also impacts all of the cells of the body, including in the brain, in the muscle, in the fat cells, etc. It is responsible for drive, both psychological drive of achievement and sexual drive. It determines focus in the brain. It gives men sort of that winning type of approach. Men with strong testosterone gives them a desire to win. That's why it's often known as the winning hormone. Men who kind of get lethargic or lack of drive or motivation, oftentimes that's a signal that testosterone levels are low. Obviously, it impacts muscle growth and muscle function, power, strength, endurance. This is why oftentimes testosterone will be used in sport. And it also gives us that V shape as men, that powerful shoulder, chest, slimmer waist, muscular physique. And of course, testosterone is very important in male health. Let's go through some of the basic physiology that you're going to need to know to understand TRT and testosterone in general. This is your brain, and in the brain, there's an area of the brain called the hypothalamus. It sends signals to communicate with the pituitary gland, which then sends out signals to the thyroid, the adrenal, and the testicles. This whole cascade of events is called the hypothalamus pituitary thyroid, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal, and the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis. So we use the term gonadal axis for the testicles because the same thing holds true in women with ovaries. So what we're really talking about here in this physiology is the HPG, or the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis. Now, the interesting thing about this is that stress of any type, decreased macronutrient intake, fat, protein, carbohydrates, decreased calorie intake, excess exercise, cold stress, heat stress, illness, toxicity issues can disrupt the hypothalamus and pituitary and cause downstream negative effects in all of these areas. You can get hypothyroid effects, adrenal fatigue, sexual and reproductive function, upset mood, weight issues, etc. The reason I'm going through this with you is because oftentimes low testosterone levels come as a result or along with issues with fatigue, issues with thyroid function, etc. And the reason why that is the case, and it can oftentimes be confusing, is because the hypothalamus and pituitary are taking a hit. It's very important that you understand the difference and also sort of the overlap between the testicular function and the thyroid and adrenal function. Oftentimes, if the hypothalamus and pituitary are having difficulty communicating with the testicles, they will also be having difficulty communicating with the thyroid and adrenal glands as well. So we oftentimes call this the HPT axis, the hypothalamus pituitary testosterone axis, or testicular axis, but the better term is the HPG axis. And here's how it works. The hypothalamus sends GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, to the pituitary, which then releases FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, which is really mostly to do with sperm, but does have some testosterone effects, and luteinizing hormone, which also has some sperm effects, but mostly testosterone effects. So there is some overlap here. These are very, very important because many of the drugs that we use in TRT will exert their influence right here with FSH and LH. Once FSH and LH interact with the testicles, you get the release of testosterone. The testicles will also release a compound called inhibin, which then both testosterone and inhibin feed back on the hypothalamus and pituitary to shut down this testicular production of testosterone. This is important because we don't want too much testosterone or too little. You can kind of think of the metabolism very much like a thermostat. And so this is the thermostat-like action of this whole HPT or HPG axis. There's a little bit more to the story because testosterone can also be made into DHT or dihydrotestosterone via an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. DHT has some implications in prostate issues, male pattern baldness, and maybe one of the major libido enhancers for men and women. Testosterone can also be converted into estrogen or estradiol via an enzyme called aromatase. And one very particular interesting aspect of testosterone function as men is that estradiol can also feed back on the hypothalamus and shut down this whole production of testosterone. And so you'll learn really quickly that this physiology that I just taught you is going to become very important to understand why we use certain drugs when we are doing TRT. So here's your brain. It communicates with the pituitary, which then communicates with the testicles. Now, primary hypogonadism is when the testicles lose their ability to produce testosterone directly. This could be due to issues in the testicle itself. It can oftentimes be due to injury, being struck or hit in the testicles. This is what we call primary hypogonadism. Typically, when you have primary hypogonadism, FSH and LH levels will be higher, and therefore they're trying to stimulate the testicles to do its job, but the testicles are not able to do it. You also can have secondary hypogonadism, which many people, especially the younger group of individuals, will be dealing with. And secondary hypogonadism comes from the brain and or the pituitary. And in this case, FSH and LH levels will be lower. And so you want to be able to understand when your doctor talks to you about primary hypogonadism, that's coming directly from the testicles versus secondary hypogonadism, which is coming from the hypothalamus pituitary axis. Most people who are listening to this particular education on TRT are probably going to be dealing with some secondary hypogonadism. Very rarely is it going to be primary hypogonadism. Oftentimes as men get much older, 65, 70s, maybe we're dealing with primary hypogonadism at that point. But oftentimes if we're dealing with stress effects and toxicity effects of the modern Western world, we're usually dealing with secondary hypogonadism. And that's going to be important as you understand further how we and why we do what we do when we do TRT therapies. Testosterone levels in the body are oftentimes bound or unbound. The bound testosterone is not usable. Only the free testosterone, or what we call free T or direct T, is usable by the body. Now, testosterone can be bound to SHBG, which is called steroid hormone binding globulin, which binds testosterone very tightly. By the way, SHBG, insulin lowers SHBG, so people who are insulin resistant and overweight oftentimes will have high SHBG levels. This is important because you can imagine if you have high SHBG levels and normal testosterone, the SHBG will bind up that testosterone, causing less free testosterone, and therefore you have testosterone lowered symptoms. That's why this is important to understand, and it's one of the things we'll assess on the blood labs. Obviously, testosterone can also be bound to albumin. That binds loosely, so we don't typically measure albumin. And of course, testosterone can be made into estrogen and DHT. So oftentimes when we do our laboratory evaluations to testosterone, we want a total testosterone, a free testosterone, an estrogen level, and an SHBG. And this tells us an awful lot about how well we're doing with bioavailability of testosterone. So we need to be aware of many things, and I'm going to teach you how to adjust these things as you go along or how to understand them. Now, this particular slide here is just basically showing you how testosterone works. Typically in the morning, right around between 6 and 10 a.m., testosterone levels rise. And you can also see the spread here between the younger individuals at the top and the older individuals at the bottom. And so testosterone does have this sort of peak where it peaks in the morning, then falls off towards the end of the night. So typically when we dose our testosterone, we'll dose it in a similar fashion where we dose first thing in the morning in order to mimic some of the natural ways that we know testosterone functions in the body. And so that's just an important thing to understand. The other thing that you need to understand is sort of the final piece of this basic physiology is that there is an epidemic, some call it a pandemic, of low testosterone in men. We're now seeing it in men in their 20s, and there's scrambling to understand why that is the case. It is most likely the case, or most physicians are agreeing, that the toxicity issues in our natural world are partly to blame and could be the main cause of low testosterone. Many of these compounds are estrogen mimickers and causing us to sort of shut down our testosterone production and interrupt testosterone production. Things like phthalates in plastics, BPAs in plastics, persistent organic pollutants is another name for these things that sort of hang around in the environment after they've been sprayed on our crops or been leached into the water. Estrogen and progesterone, due to oral contraceptive use, due to high consumption of dairy products which have estrogen and progesterones in them, can potentially be an issue here. And oftentimes this is why we want to focus on with men, especially if you think you're being dealing with this, making sure you're eating organic foods. If you can't get organic foods, making sure you're eating low fat foods, not going a low fat diet, but eating lower fat animal products, since animals basically bioaccumulate these pesticides in their fat tissue. And so there's some issues around this, but mostly I'm just drawing your attention to the fact that why are we having very low testosterone even in young men? So you want to, if you're worried about this, avoid plastics, try to drink out of glass and things like that, spend time in sauna therapies and sweating a lot so that you can remove some of these persistent organic pollutants out of your system. Avoid estrogen containing and progesterone containing foods, which typically means making sure you're eating foods that are organic in nature primarily, and lower in fat if we're talking about the animal products. Not necessarily a concern when we're talking about some of the vegetable-based products and things like that. Very important that you understand this. And I'll just mention here one of the best ways for us men to make sure that we are detoxing on a regular basis is to get into a routine of sweating. This can be done through sauna therapies, infrared saunas. Many of my clients and patients over the years own infrared saunas and do some of this infrared sauna therapy to get some of these things out of their system, which can be very, very useful to their system.